The winter winds howled like ghosts over the towers of Winterfell, carrying the weight of secrets buried deep in the snow. Ned Stark stood in the godswood, silent beneath the heart tree, its red leaves fluttering like spilled blood against the cold grey sky. In his arms the babe slept, wrapped in thick furs that did little to soften the enormity of the burden he carried. But this time, something was different. This time, he would not lie. Catelyn's eyes burned when he returned home with the child, but they didn't burn with confusion or jealousy. They burned with betrayal. "Whose is he?" she asked, voice a quiet fire. "Tell me the truth, Ned." He met her gaze, not as a husband pleading for understanding, but as a father demanding sanctuary. "He is mine," Ned said, letting the words settle. "My blood, my son. His mother died in childbirth, and I will not dishonor her by hiding him in shame. He will be raised as a Stark." Catelyn flinched as if struck. "A Stark? Not a Snow? You would give him the name of your house while my own children, our children, grow beside him?" "Yes," Ned said, and his voice was a blade now. "Because he is just as much my child as Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. His name is Jon Stark, and I will not see him bear the shame of a lie I never wanted to tell." And so it was done. In the great hall of Winterfell, before lords and bannermen, Ned introduced his sixth child, Jon Stark, son of Eddard Stark of Winterfell. The rumours flew like birds into every corner of the north and beyond. The south whispered tales of Ned Stark's hidden lusts, of secret mistresses and bastard-born heirs legitimized by guilt. But Ned did not care. He'd made a vow to his sister, Lyanna, and this time he would not break it. Catelyn did not forgive him, but she obeyed her duty. Jon was raised alongside the other Stark children, eating at the high table, training with Ser Rodrik, learning the words and the weight of winter is coming like any true-born lordling. The servants bowed to him. The lords acknowledged him, and yet something always lingered, a shadow that clung to his steps, because Jon was never really treated as equal. Not by Catelyn, who could not look at him without remembering her own humiliation. Not by some of the Stark bannermen who whispered behind cold ale cups about Ned's southern son, and not even by himself. He grew up wearing the Stark name but never feeling its warmth. Robb was his best friend, his brother in truth and in all things but blood. Yet Jon always sensed the difference. Robb would be lord one day, and Jon would be, what? A commander? A knight? A ghost in a castle? That wasn't truly his. Still, there was love in Winterfell. Arya adored him, chasing him through the kennels and archery ranges, always calling him my favorite brother. Bran looked up to him like a hero. Even Rickon, too young to understand the politics of blood and shame, reached for Jon before anyone else when he cried. And Ned gave Jon what he could, patience, guidance, honor, but not the truth. And Jon knew there was a truth, hidden in the long silences, the way Maester Luwin paused when asked about his mother, the way Catelyn clenched her jaw when he entered a room years past. Jon grew tall and strong, with a direwolf named Ghost who followed him like a second shadow. He trained harder than the others, read more, practiced longer, seeking not only to earn his name, but to escape the weight it carried. It was during the long winter nights that he would stand at the battlements, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, wondering what lay beyond the wall, wondering why he always felt like a stranger in the only home he'd ever known. But he was a Stark. That was the one truth Ned Stark had given him, and soon that truth would be tested. The raven came at dawn. Its wings beat furiously against the grey skies, feathers soaked from snow as it landed on the Maester's tower. By midday, Ned Stark stood in the great hall, the scroll clenched tightly in his gloved hand. Jon watched from the steps, eyes following, his father's every move. The hall was quieter than usual, the tension so thick even Ghost had gone still at his feet. Robert Baratheon was coming to Winterfell. The King. Jon didn't know how to feel. The name meant little to him except for whispered stories and drunken ramblings about rebellion, and a war fought over a woman named Lyanna, his supposed aunt. A woman no one talked about in front of him. Robb was excited, of course. "We'll feast for days," he said, slapping John on the shoulder. "You'll see. They say King Robert is as big as a bear and twice as loud. You'll like him." John gave a small smile, but something twisted in his gut. He didn't like the way his father had gone silent after reading the letter. He didn't like the flicker of fear, yes, fear, that had passed across Lord Stark's normally stoic face. John knew something was coming, something that would shake more than just the walls of Winterfell. When the royal procession arrived, John stood at the back of the welcoming party. Though he bore the name Stark, there were still rules, especially when Southern eyes were watching. He was not introduced to the king, he was not presented with the others. Ned had ordered it. "You'll attend the feast. But stay out of Robert's sight," he had said. "Why?" John asked, trying not to sound wounded. Ned's mouth tightened. "Because he is not the man he once was, and he may not be kind to you." John clenched his fists. "I thought I was a Stark." "You are," Ned said softly, "but even Starks bleed, John." The feast was a thunderstorm of noise, meat, and wine. John sat near the end of the table beside some of the younger squires, close enough to see the king but far enough to be invisible. Robert was exactly as described, huge, loud, drunk, and careless. But what shook John more than the king's booming voice or crude jokes was the way his father looked when Robert mentioned Lyanna. "She was meant to be my queen," Robert said, his eyes glassy. "I still dream of her." Ned flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but John saw it. And so did Catelyn, who glanced sharply at her husband. Later that night, John found himself alone in the crypts. He often came here when the castle felt too full, too fake. The silence beneath the earth was more honest. The statues of ancient kings didn't whisper about his mother. They didn't stare at him like he didn't belong. He stopped in front of Lyanna's statue. There were no flowers, no candle. Just cold stone and a name. He reached out and touched the base of the statue. "Who were you?" he whispered. "You shouldn't be down here." John spun around. Ned stood at the entrance to the crypt, shadows painting his face. "Neither should you," John said quietly. Ned walked closer, his boots echoing. He stopped beside John and looked up at the face of his dead sister. "I come here to remember," he said, "and to remind myself what promises cost." John swallowed. "She was my aunt." Ned said nothing. John turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. "Was she my mother?" Ned didn't move, didn't even blink. The silence stretched. So long John thought he'd imagined the question. Then finally Ned spoke. "You are my son, and I have never lied about that, but not her son. I made a promise, John, one that's kept you alive, and that is all I can say." John looked back at Lyanna's face. He felt colder than ever. He wanted to shout, to demand the truth, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was knowing that some truths, once spoken, could never be unspoken. The king left Winterfell with half his court and a storm of rumors in his wake. The great halls fell quiet again, but the silence felt different this time, heavy, watchful. John noticed it first in the way the maids spoke more softly, how Cere. Roderick began training them with more urgency, and how Maester Luwin always seemed to be writing raven scrolls late into the night. Something was shifting. Catelyn barely looked at John anymore. Not that she ever had with warmth, but now there was a cold finality in her silence. It was as if King Robert's visit had reawakened an old wound that she could no longer ignore. One evening, John passed her in the corridor. She paused, looked at him with eyes like ice, and said, "You should never have been named Stark. It was mercy that did you no good." Then she walked on, leaving John frozen in place. That night, he found himself standing at the window of his chamber, staring out into the dark forests beyond the walls. Ghost stood beside him, ears alert. The moon cast long skeletal shadows over the trees. "Maybe I don't belong here," John muttered, his voice barely above the wind. He thought about the wall often these days. It called to him, not with promise, but with purpose. He didn't crave glory or adventure like the tale spoke of. What he wanted was clarity. In Winterfell, every word, every glance was layered with hidden meanings. At the Wall, everything seemed simpler. You served or you didn't. You fought or you died. You earned your place with your actions, not your birth. But even if he went, what would he leave behind? Robb, who was beginning to speak like a young lord more than a brother. Arya, who had started calling him the only real person in this place. Bran, whose wide eyes trusted him more than anyone else. And Lord Stark, Ned, who for all his silence and restraint had loved him fiercely in his own way. Still, Jon felt more alone than ever. That feeling deepened the day Ned summoned him to the Godswood. Snow dusted the leaves of the weirwood, its red eyes watching as if it too waited for the truth. Jon approached slowly. Ned stood with his back to him, hands clasped behind his back, his cloak fluttering in the cold wind. "You've been troubled," Ned said without turning. Jon didn't deny it. "I don't belong here." "That's not true." "I don't belong anywhere," Jon replied. "The Stark name doesn't protect me from whispers. Not from Lady Stark, not from the truth. I walk through these halls like a shadow." Ned turned then, his face lined deeper than usual. "You are young, you don't yet understand what names cost." "Then tell me," Jon said, stepping closer. "Tell me why you gave me yours when everyone hates me for it." For a moment, it looked like Ned might finally say the words. His mouth opened, but nothing came. Only silence. "Is it shame?" Jon asked, voice raw now. "Am I so shameful that even the truth is too heavy for you?" Ned looked into his son's eyes and saw the storm he'd been trying to protect him from. But Jon was no longer a boy, not entirely, and the weight of secrets was beginning to crush him. "I made a promise, Jon. I swore it on my sister's grave. And until the time is right, I cannot break it, even if it means you hate me for it." Jon's eyes burned. "I don't hate you. I want to know who I am." "You're my son," Ned said. "That is enough." Jon nodded slowly, but inside it wasn't enough. The next day, Robb found him in the yard, sword in hand, practicing long after the others had gone in. "You're going to wear that blade down to the hilt," Robb joked. "I need to be ready," Jon muttered. "For what?" "For wherever I end up." Robb fell quiet, watching his brother's hard expression. "You've changed since the king came," Robb said. "You seem like you're already leaving." Jon didn't reply. He just lifted his sword again and began to swing. In the tower above, Catelyn watched through the window, her lips pressed in a thin, grim line. She knew Jon was planning something, and a part of her feared what would happen when he finally acted on it, because boys like Jon didn't run away. They disappeared. The ravens flew again, this time with black ribbons tied to their legs. News of Bran's fall spread like frostbite. Fast, silent and deadly. The boy had been found broken beneath the tower, limbs shattered, body barely breathing. The castle fell into a stunned hush, as though the walls themselves had been struck dumb. Jon was in the yard when he heard. Robb came running, face pale, voice cracking with disbelief. "Bran fell. From the tower. They don't know if he'll—" "Wake up." Jon didn't answer. He just dropped his training sword and ran. Inside the castle, the air was thick with grief and suspicion. Maester Luwin worked without rest. Catelyn didn't leave Bran's side. She refused to eat, sleep, or even speak, except to whisper Bran's name over and over again like a prayer. Jon stood outside the chamber door, unsure if he was allowed in. Every time he stepped closer, he could feel Catelyn's hatred waiting like a blade behind the door. But this wasn't about her. He opened the door and entered. Bran lay still, his small chest rising and falling faintly, like a flicker of life trying not to go out. Catelyn sat beside him, her eyes sunken, her hand clutching his tightly. She looked up as Jon entered, and her face curdled like spoiled milk. "You don't belong here," she said, voice hoarse. "I just want to see him," Jon said. "You're not his brother." Jon didn't flinch, but the words hit anyway. Catelyn stood. Her hand trembled. "Every time I look at you, I see a lie, a betrayal that wears my husband's name like a stolen cloak. Don't stand there and pretend you care. Just leave." Jon's throat tightened. He looked at Bran, then back at Catelyn. "I am his brother," he said quietly, "even if you can't accept it." She stepped forward then, fury radiating off her in waves. Do you want to know why I've never been able to accept you, John? Because every day you live under this roof, you remind me that Ned chose you, over truth, over honor, over me. John didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out, each step heavier than the last. The door shut behind him like a tomb. By dusk, he'd made his decision. Robb found him packing in the cold room near the armory. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to the wall," John said, tying a cloak roll to his pack. Robb's eyes widened. "You can't just leave." "I can, and I will. There's no place for me here anymore." Robb stepped forward, voice tense. "This isn't just about Catelyn. This is about Bran, isn't it?" John looked away. "Everything I touch feels wrong here, even Bran. It's like I don't know who I am and no one else does either. Maybe at the wall I can be something more than a name that doesn't fit." Robb nodded slowly, jaw clenched. "Then I'm coming with you to say goodbye." At the gates, John stood in the snow with Ghost at his side. Arya came running, red-faced and breathless, holding out a bundle. "It's a cloak," she said. "I stitched it myself. You'll need it." John smiled and pulled her into a hug. "Thank you, little sister. I'm not so little anymore. You'll always be little to me." Sansa didn't come. Rickon didn't understand. Bran remained in limbo, neither alive nor dead. But Ned was there. He stood beside John at the gate, eyes shadowed, lips pressed into a line. "You don't have to do this," he said. "There's still a place for you here." John shook his head. There never really was. Ned looked at him a long time, like he wanted to speak the truth, the real truth. But once again, it stayed buried. Instead, he said, "When we meet, again I'll tell you everything, I swear it." John blinked, surprised by the sudden softness in his voice. "Promise?" "I promise." They embraced tightly. And then John rode north with Benjen Stark and the others, leaving Winterfell behind, unaware that he'd just seen his father for the last time. The cold grew sharper as the wall drew closer, but inside Jon Stark, something else was growing too, a storm. And it wouldn't stay buried for long. Castle Black was nothing like the stories. Jon had imagined a mighty fortress etched into a wall of ice, with warriors wrapped in black cloaks, standing tall against the winds. What he found instead was rot, ruin. Cold men with colder eyes. Most of them were not noble-born or brave. They were thieves, murderers, liars, and cowards. Cast-offs the rest of the realm wanted to forget, and now Jon Stark was one of them. He kept to himself in those first days, training harder than most, besting his opponents with ease. The others began to call him Lord Snow, not as a compliment but as a sneer. Even though he bore the name Stark, to them he would always be some high-born brat with soft hands and a sense of superiority. But Jon didn't feel superior. He felt lost. The cold seeped into his bones, and not even Ghost's quiet presence could warm the emptiness growing inside him. He thought of Winterfell often, Robb's easy laughter, Arya's wild eyes, the way the walls had always felt too big, too silent. But most of all he thought of Ned, of the promise he'd made at the gates. "When we meet again, I'll tell you everything." But Jon didn't know then that the gods had already decided otherwise. The news came in pieces, scattered from raven to raven, each word a nail in the coffin of his past. First, King Robert is dead. Then, Ned Stark has been arrested for treason, and finally he was executed on the steps of the Great Sept, beheaded like a common traitor. Jon didn't scream, didn't cry. He just stood there frozen in the courtyard of Castle Black as the snow fell around him, hands trembling but fists clenched. Inside him something snapped, not loudly, not all at once, but like a piece of himself had turned to stone. He didn't speak for 2 days. When he finally did, it was to Maester Aemon, who found him staring at the wall. "I should ride south," Jon said, "to help Robb, to kill every Lannister I see." Maester Aemon's old eyes regarded him calmly. "Then you would break every vow you've taken." "I don't care. You do. That's why you're in pain." Jon turned sharply. He was, "My father." Aemon nodded. "And what did your father teach you, Jon Stark?" Jon's jaw worked. "Honor. And what would you sacrifice to keep it?" Jon didn't answer. Aemon placed a withered hand on his shoulder. "You are not the First to be torn between love and duty. And you won't be the last, but the choice must still be made. Every man must decide who he is. That night, John sat alone in the dark, staring into the small fire flickering in his chamber. Ghost lay beside him, eerily still. The flames crackled softly, the only sound in the void that had become his mind. He reached into his pack and pulled out the cloak Arya had given him. The stitching was uneven, messy, but it was hers. A reminder that someone had loved him without condition, and that maybe he did still belong to something. The next day he returned to training. Not for glory, not to impress, but because something inside him had hardened. His father was dead, his family scattered. But he still had his name, John Stark. He would make it mean something, no matter what blood ran in his veins, no matter how. Many whispers circled the truth of who his mother had been. Whether Stark, Snow, or something else entirely, he would forge his own legacy. And in the distance, beyond the frozen horizon, the cold began to stir. Something ancient, something waiting. The wind beyond the wall was no longer just cold, it whispered. At night John would lie awake, listening to the groan of ice against stone, the shifting of snow in places no man had walked for centuries. Ghost paced restlessly, his red eyes always turned north, ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The rangers spoke in low tones around the fire. Men were disappearing, wildlings were on the move. But there were darker stories too, of eyes like blue glass, of dead men who walked and screamed without tongues. John wanted to believe it was just fear talking, but fear, he learned, had teeth. Lord. Commander Mormont summoned him on the 5th morning, after a fresh patrol failed to return. John entered the solar expecting orders. Instead, he found the old bear sitting stiffly, a grim look in his eyes. "We ride at dawn," Mormont said. "You're coming with us." "Beyond the wall?" John asked, heart jumping. "Yes, we're taking a strong force to investigate the disappearances and what's stirring the wildlings. You'll ride with your uncle's men." Benjen. hadn't seen him in weeks. Since his uncle's last short-range patrol, he'd expected him to return within days, yet he never had. "You think something's happened to him?" "I think something's happening to all of us," Mormont said. "And I'd rather have a Stark with us than leave you behind with the cook's boy and piss-bucket thieves." That night, John stared out at the wall one last time from the top of the icy ramparts. Beneath him, the world fell away into a blanket of black pine and endless snow. He didn't feel fear. He felt ready. Whatever lived out there, ghost, wildling, or monster, it was part of the truth now. And John was done running from it. They left before first light. John rode beside Sir Jeremy Riker, his breath fogging in front of him, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Ghost padded silently. Through the snow beside them, so pale he was almost invisible. By midday the trees swallowed them whole. There were no birds. No wind, just silence. They found the first body near dusk, frozen, blue and eyeless. It hadn't been mauled by an animal, it hadn't bled, it had simply stopped being alive. And yet its mouth was stretched in a scream that hadn't been heard. John stood over it, stomach twisting. This wasn't the wildlings. No, Mormont said, it wasn't. That night, the dead man walked. John woke to Ghost snarling, teeth bared. The camp was chaos, shouting, steel clashing, and a sound John couldn't explain. A rattle that had no breath behind it. The corpse they'd found was alive, moving, fighting, killing, and it wasn't alone. John grabbed a burning log from the fire and struck it with all his strength. The thing hissed, smoke rising from its cold, rotting flesh, but it didn't scream. It didn't bleed. It just lunged again, mouth wide, eyes empty. Mormont finished it with fire. When it was over, the camp stood in stunned silence. One man dead, 2 wounded, the others shaken beyond repair. "This is what we're facing?" John asked, still breathing. "Hard." "No," Mormont said grimly. "This is the beginning." The next morning, John rode with eyes wide open. He'd left Winterfell to escape a name, to find peace in isolation, but now he understood. There was no peace coming, Not for the realms of men, not for the Starks, and certainly not for Jon Stark, the boy raised under a false name, carrying a truth buried deeper than any grave. He was not just a Stark, not just a bastard, not just a brother of the Night's Watch. He was something else. And north of the wall, something had sensed it, something that remembered the blood of old kings and fallen dragons, something that had waited centuries for a fire to rise again in the cold. The fire within him didn't feel like heat. It felt like purpose. Jon Stark rode back through the gates of Castle Black days later, face gaunt, eyes sunken from the things he'd seen, and worse, from what he now believed. The dead did not stay. Dead. The wall was not just stone and ice, and the Night's Watch wasn't prepared for what was coming. No one was. The ravens flew, carrying warnings southward, but Jon knew most lords would scoff at the letters. Dead men walking? Icy monsters in the woods? They'd laugh in their silk-lined halls, wrapped in arrogance and denial. But it was real, and Winterfell was now in danger. His home, what little of it remained, because the other news had come too. Robb Stark marched to war. The banners of the North had been called. The young wolf had crossed the neck, and Winterfell had fallen. The Boltons dart traitors from within, cowards with blades sharper than their loyalty. The flayed man flew over Winterfell now, and Jon could only imagine what had become of the place that once held the only warmth he'd ever known. "I need to go south," he told Mormont one night. "Winterfell is in flames. My brother is at war. My sisters could be prisoners or dead. I can't stay here and pretend this wall matters more than my blood." Mormont stared at him from across the fire. "And yet, you took the black. I didn't take it to let monsters burn my family's home." "Then you took it for the wrong reasons." Jon's fists clenched. "You expect me to sit here while the last of the Starks are hunted down like dogs? I expect you to be a man, and a man honors his vows, even when it breaks him." Jon stood, firelight flickering against his face. "Then maybe I'm not a man yet." He left the tent before Mormont could answer. Ghost followed in silence. Temptation gnawed at him that night, louder than any promise he'd ever made. He thought of Robb, of Arya, gods if she still lived, of Sansa in King's Landing, or worse, in the dungeons of the Boltons. He thought of Rickon, too young to even know what war was, and Bran, broken and lost to the wilds. He had a sword. He had a name. He had fire in his blood, even if he didn't know why it burned. But when dawn came, he hadn't ridden south. He stayed. Because deep inside, even as the wall loomed like a silent judge, Jon Stark knew this wasn't the end of his path. It was the beginning. That night, Sam approached him timidly, scroll in hand. "I found something. About the others. In the old records." Jon barely looked up. "Will it help us kill them?" "Maybe. Or at least stop them." Sam unrolled the parchment. Faded ink. Ancient Valyrian. Jon couldn't read it, but the words chilled him anyway. "It mentions a bloodline," Sam said slowly. "That can resist the darkness, not just fight it, but change it." Jon blinked. "What bloodline?" Sam hesitated. "The Targaryens." The name hit Jon like a fist to the chest. He'd heard it before, of course. Mad kings, dragons, fire and blood. But in that moment something clicked. Memories of Ned's eyes, always looking away when he asked about his mother. Lyanna's statue. The way Catelyn could never fully explain her hatred. "No," Jon said, shaking his head. "I'm a Stark." Sam frowned. "Are you?" Jon stormed off into the snow, heart racing. He wanted to scream, to rip apart the truth with his bare hands, but deep down he already knew. He wasn't just Ned Stark's son, he was Lyanna's son, and Rhaegar's. The blood of dragon and wolf ran in his veins. That was the truth Ned had taken to his grave. And the reason Jon had never fit anywhere in a world built on lies. He looked out over the wall, the night wind cutting like razors across his face. The wall wasn't just a boundary. It was a line in the snow between the world that had always lied to him and the one that was now demanding he take a side. Jon Stark. Jon Snow. Jon Targaryen? He didn't know who he was anymore, but he knew one thing: the wall wouldn't stand forever, and neither would he. The wind howled with a new voice now, a voice that called his name, Not Jon Snow, not Lord Snow, not even Stark. Just Jon, like the wall itself, had peeled back its icy lips and was whispering secrets meant only for him. He couldn't sleep anymore, couldn't rest. His dreams were fire and blood and cold hands reaching for him from the darkness. He dreamed of Winterfell burning and the Red Keep collapsing. He dreamed of direwolves howling in agony, and a woman's voice, soft, sorrowful. "Promise me, Jon." Each day Jon trained harder, spoke less, watched the horizon like it would bleed open and reveal everything all at once. Sam kept bringing him old texts, half-burned scrolls and forgotten scraps that spoke of ancient kings with dragon's blood, of white shadows marching through snow, and of a prince that was promised. "I think it's you," Sam had whispered once, almost two, afraid to say it. Jon didn't answer. He didn't believe in prophecies, but he did believe in silence, in the weight of unspoken truths. And the more he remembered his father's eyes, the sadness buried beneath the honor, the more Jon knew that his life had always been a lie, a necessary one, but a lie nonetheless. He stood on top of the wall one morning, looking south toward what was left of his family. Robb, if he still lived, Arya missing, Sansa imprisoned, Rickon vanished, Bran. No one knew. He was a Stark only in name, a Targaryen only in blood, and a bastard to both. That made him something else entirely. When the next wave of dead men came, they came without sound. No horns, no cries, just the crunch of snow under bone and ice. Ghost snarled before any man saw them. Jon was the first to draw steel. He shouted until his voice cracked, pulling the Black Brothers into a line, forming a defense at the gate. But it wasn't enough. They had grown in number, smarter, faster. The cold they brought wasn't just wind anymore. It killed. Jon fought, like a man possessed. Every strike was rage, every parry was loss. When Sir Ottyn Withers fell beside him, eyes frozen over before he hit the ground, Jon barely paused. He killed 3 whites, then 4, then a 5th. But they kept coming. And, behind them, he saw the thing he feared most, one of them with blue eyes not like the others, a White Walker. Time slowed. The creature stepped forward, elegant in its horror, its ice blade dragging a song of death across the stone. Jon raised Longclaw. Their swords met. Steel screamed against ice, and when Jon struck again, his blade shattered. The White Walker's weapon. In a burst of light and frost, the creature fell, howling into the void. The whites paused, then collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. Silence returned, but not peace. Mormont limped toward him, eyes wide. What was that? Jon didn't know, not really. But something in his blood had answered the cold. He felt it burning in his chest now. Fire. When they returned to Castle Black, the Black Brothers looked at him differently. No longer as the bastard boy from the north, no longer Lord Snow. They looked at him like a weapon. Mormont pulled him aside. "We need to send ravens, all of them. If you can kill one of those, then the Lords of the Realm need to know who you are." Jon shook his head. "They'll never listen. They didn't listen to my father. They won't listen to a bastard." "You're not a bastard," Mormont said. Jon stared. "You believe the stories." "I believe what I saw, and so do the others." Jon walked alone that night beneath the stars. He stopped at the old weirwood tree that grew behind the wall, far from where it should have survived. He knelt in front of it and whispered for the first time, "I don't know who I am. I don't know if I'm a Stark, a Targaryen, or just some ghost with the wrong name. But if there are gods listening, tell me what to do." The leaves rustled, and for a moment the wind felt warm. Jon stood. The wall wouldn't stand forever, but when it fell, he would be ready. Not as Jon Snow, not even as Jon Stark, but as the man who carried both names and the burden that came with them.